I'm Chris Burns, and welcome to The Network, where we connect into a matrix of newsmakers to get to the heart of an issue. And watch out, they've got to answer in 25 seconds or less, or else. Let's take a look at that issue right now. Their speeches are often stridently eurosceptic. Right-wing members of the European Parliament passing on the anger of their voters to the halls of power.
L'État est chargé de défendre ses citoyens.
Critics call some of their stands ultranationalist, xenophobic, outright racist. Mainstream political groups want to strip them of their EU funding, including 400,000 euros for the anti-immigrant British National Party. The Alliance of European National Movements could also see funding cut, a grouping that includes far-right parties in Bulgaria, Hungary, Italy, and the UK, as well as individual MEPs from France and other countries. Some say that elected officials have the right to express themselves in Parliament, even if they seem to be biting the hand that feeds them. Should there be limits to that kind of free speech, or could cutting off funding to Eurosceptic politicians only drive the wedge deeper between their tax-paying voters and the EU? Now wired into this edition of The Network is, from London, Alexandra Swann, journalist, blogger, and activist for the Eurosceptic UK Independence Party, or UKIP. Here at the European Parliament in Brussels, Emilie van Haute, professor of political science at the Free University of Brussels, or ULB. And from Madrid, Enrique Guerrero, a member of the European Parliament and vice chair of the Socialists and Democrats Party Group, or S&D. Let me start with a question with you, Enrique. First of all, you're on the Parliament Constitutional Affairs Committee considering this proposal. Why push for it now?
Well, you know, it's not about free speech. Everyone can speak as they decide. It's not also about Euroscepticism. You can be in your program Eurosceptic and you can fight for the disappearance of the European Union. It's about the respect of the Charter of Fundamental Rights.
Okay, Alexandra, you describe yourself as an anarcho-capitalist. Does that mean that you don't want any funding for any party? How do you see this?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think any political party should be funded by the taxpayer at all. But I think if you are going to fund any parties, then, you know, I think the British National Party are utterly, they're terrible. They're all, I can't understand why anyone would ever vote for them. But the fact is, nearly 1 million people did vote for them. And those people, you know, they deserve to have the same democratic rights and therefore the same funding for the party that they support. Okay, even if they're saying some outrageous things. Emilie, what do you think?
Well, I think there's two debates here. There's the debate about the criteria and conditions to be eligible for funding, and should we introduce or strengthen these criteria, as it is the case in some national states, for example, Belgium. And then the second debate is who's going to control if we introduce new conditions, new criteria.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Enrique, so what limits should there be to free speech in the Parliament?
The question is, how are you eligible to get European public funding?
Exactly.
And we in the Constitutional Affairs Committee, we are deciding that if there is any conflict, the final decision should be in the hands of the European Court of Justice.
Okay, but Alexandra, don't you think that, you know, cutting off the money to the British National Party, wouldn't that make things worse? Wouldn't that just make the Eurosceptic taxpayers even angrier? Whilst, you know, as you said before, no political party should receive funding at all. And if you give the BNP a chance, you know, if everyone else is going to be funded, the far left are going to be funded. When you've got, you know, a Stasi informant MEP in Germany, and you've got, you know, Latvian communists allowed to have funding, then why would you stop another party? It just seems entirely wrong, and it gives the BNP the opportunity to play the victim and get more support in that sense. Right. Emilie, are European values so fragile that they must be protected by limiting free speech in the Parliament?
Well, this issue of principles, and that's a debate, and I think there's a multiple answer to that debate. But then there's also the question of the effects of such a measure.
Right.
And the effects are not that clear-cut. If you take the Belgian example, one party was banned from, was brought to court, and then just changed its name and was eligible again for funding.
Okay, so Enrique, do you see it more that way? And forget about cutting off their money, just sue them.
What do you think?
You repeat many times free speech banned in the parliament, but that doesn't exist. I mean, I hear every plenary session Mr. Nigel Farage and other European eurosceptics expressing their views. And
sure, they can express their views, but should they be punished by having their money cut off?
Well, but it is not because of, I mean, not talking about UKIP, but in general, not about ideology, it's about the behavior. I mean, you can be Republican in a monarchy, you can be communist in a free market country, and that happens in many European countries. But you cannot be offensive to the human beings. You cannot be offensive to the women in a society.
Okay.
You cannot propose violence as a means for political action.
Is that what you're alleging that they're saying?
This is the behavior, not the ideology.
All right. Alexandra, how do you answer that?
I think it's a very slippery slope. I think when you decide that you're going to cut off, you know, when someone that controls the money, and keep in mind there's no such thing as public money, there's taxpayers' money. And these taxpayers have a vote. And when you have taxpayers who are voting for a political party, no matter how unsavoury you might find that party, other political parties should not be able to dictate in Brussels, an unelected body in Brussels should certainly not be able to dictate who receives funding.
Emilie, slippery slope. I mean, where do you stand really on this? You say this is an issue, but should there be a limit? Should there be a limit to free speech or not? Should it be wide open? Should people be able to say anything they want in the Parliament?
This free speech is guaranteed within the EU Parliament. But then there's the question of funding. And if you look at what's happening at the national level, well, you've got both answers in terms of funding. Some states decided to put criteria on funding, public funding of parties. Some didn't. Yeah.
Well, what about maybe you know, in some extreme cases, and this is in certain countries in Europe, you can't deny there was a Holocaust. You can't make comments that are going to stir racial hatred. Do you see limits like that, Alexandra?
Yes, I mean, obviously it's legal to incite racial hatred, but you know, some of these parties, it's interesting that the European Parliament are only considering what they perceive as the far-right parties. I mean, there's a Latvian MEP who staged, you know, a very violent communist coup against the government.
So you think the far left should also be punished then? Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, I don't think anyone should be punished. But I think if you're going to look at the right, the left has also got a lot of questions to answer as well. The far left in Europe is just as unsavoury, and there are just as many dodgy characters with interesting histories and political views as there are on the right. But you know, because Brussels is such a a left-wing institution, you obviously have the focus on the right, not on the left.
Okay, Emilie, if this does go ahead, if they do go ahead and cut off funding to parties like that, what would the impact be, you think?
The impact is quite minimal. First, because the procedure is quite long to get to the funding cut. And second, because parties can regenerate themselves and present themselves as under a different label. And in that sense, they would be eligible again.
Okay, and Enrique, don't you fear causing more anger among these taxpayers who are supporting parties like this?
The things that we are going to try to put in action is transparency of every public finance and also respect of the fundamental rights. But I agree with the Belgian professor that it is quite difficult to ban the finance of political parties because at the end there is also a judicial defense of the right of the political parties to express their political platform.
Very complicated issue. Thanks all very much for joining us. That's all the time we've got for now. I'd like to thank our guests, Alexandra Swann, Emilie van Haute, and Enrique Guerrero. I'm Chris Burns. And until next time, thanks for connecting with The Network.